Good afternoon. My name is Don Tonti-Ploffel, and I'm the Associate Director of Academic Ventures and Engagement at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. At the start, let me acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and our annual donors tuned in this afternoon. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public. We thank you. It is my distinct honor and profound pleasure to welcome you to today's exciting event in our annual series, the Roosevelt Poetry Readings, which brings poets of recognized stature to the Institute. I'm especially gratified that today's reading and conversation will also develop themes, experiences, and reflections on our life in a time of climate crisis. This is because earlier this academic year, in October of 2022, we launched our multi-year focus area on climate change and climate justice. This climate change initiative is our institute-wide, multidisciplinary, and multimodal effort to investigate the causes and consequences of the climate crisis, to develop strategies in adaptation and mitigation, and to address issues of climate justice in thought and in action, analytically, normatively, socially, politically, and, in light of today's event, with the boundless powers of imagination, language, and creative expression. In particular, we seek to address all aspects of the climate crisis, especially as they bear on marginalized perspectives and vulnerable communities, locally, regionally, and globally. At the heart of this work is Radcliffe's commitment to supporting and sharing work that promotes innovative solutions, critical conversation, and greater equity. This reflects Radcliffe's bedrock commitment to interdisciplinary study and the creative articulation of problems and solutions, informed by an equally deep dedication to inclusion. We firmly believe that these approaches will generate valuable new insights into effective and equitable and emancipatory ways of addressing climate change. Today's Roosevelt Poetry Reading, to be given by our featured poet, Anthony Cody, followed by a conversation with fellow poet Douglas Kearney, brings into focus the Institute's emphasis on spotlighting work at the cutting edge of the arts and humanities, and also its work on climate change from a multidisciplinary perspective. Now, we all know, or should know, that the climate crisis is in significant ways anthropogenic, or human-caused. But we also know, or should know, that it is human-suffered by humans, anthropopathemic. What explains this suffering? What can give it voice and articulation? What is this suffering like? And who are forced to bear the brunt of this suffering? Suffering means to endure pain, but it also means, more generally, to endure or undergo change. What changes are happening before us, before our senses? How are traditional separations between persons, communities, and nation states changing? As Teju Cole has said, what you say in answer will depend on whether a border is in front of you or behind you. I mentioned above the power of poetry as a concatenation of the boundless powers of imagination, language, and creative expression. How can the boundlessness of poetry overcome the bounds, the boundaries, the borderlands that separate us? To riff on a line from our featured poet for today, what binaries will stand in the face of the climate crisis? Equally, I ask, what boundaries can withstand the force of the poem? What must change? What is already melting away? Anthony Cody is the co-publisher of Noemi Press, poetry editor for Omnidawn, and faculty in poetry in the MFA program of Randolph College. He is the author of 2 collections of poetry, most recently The Rendering, the post-publication debut reading from which is today's event, I'm excited to say. Our discussant and moderator is Douglas Kearney, Assistant Professor of English and McKnight Presidential Fellow at the University of Minnesota. He has published 7 books, most recently by Wave Press, Show. A fuller list of our speakers' numerous awards and publications, too long and impressive to recite here, is available on the Radcliffe website. Finally, on behalf of Professor Kearney, I encourage the audience here to use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time during the program. Please keep your questions concise so that we can explore as many topics as possible. It is now my pleasure to give the virtual floor to our Roosevelt poet, Anthony Cody.
Thank you so much, Don, for that wonderful introduction. I'm truly honored to be here reading for the Roosevelt series at the Radcliffe Institute. I'm grateful for all your work and labor, Don, and everyone else in helping put the event together. I'm also genuinely excited to be here today with Douglas Kearney, which truly is a gift to be able to talk with a hero, one of my own personal heroes, shortly after I read some poems. And I'm also honored for all of you to be out here in the Zoom land, to sit here with me while I read poems from my new book, The Rendering, which definitely explores climate change, climate collapse, but also through a lens of the Dust Bowl. Historically, we see ourselves doing this and doing this again, and continuing to look away towards what we've done in this white settler colonialist empire that we exist in, even to the point of now thinking about what does the future look like. And that's kind of the trajectory of what I'll be reading today. I really appreciate how Don mentioned pushing boundaries, pushing borders. One of the things that I definitely think through when I'm making a poem is how can I not only explode the page, but how does the page and even form serve as its own border that I want to sort of break apart? Without going much further, I'm going to just dive into some poems. I'm going to read about, let's say 6 or 7, depending on time, and go from there. I'm going to share my screen, so that'll help us kind of navigate through. This first poem, as I've skipped all the way ahead, is actually the opening poem from the book, Cada día más cerca del fin del mundo, which translates into Every Day Closer to the End of the World, which I have in conversation of doom scrolling through Twitter. And this is what happens when you find yourself at 2 a.m. doom scrolling through Twitter. In the scrolling, witness a logging machine annihilate a tree into parts. This is social media. 20 seconds. A buzzing fells, strips, apportions the once breathing into a quiet slumber of kindling. Understanding the mechanisms, know the automated is never of production, of scarcity, but of mass replication. Acres never seized or ceased. My tongue slips into the mind-gulp desert, forest, jungle, cleaved into the flatness of the fabulous. Not a single trunk will echo amplification in ribcage affixed as crown in the fence coffin light. Fuel fossil, outcome, transmittal, horizon, left pile 1.5 degrees centigrade corpus, no silent above outwork, choking institutional pre-industrial kernel, landstone levels error, atmospheric effluent, visible fall debris well, denial plume, logic failure, epic, obliterate deprivation, unfavorable, monitoring wholeness. Fuel fossil, land choking, no left, fuel fossil, atmospheric debris, logic deprivation, outcome, stone, institutional, silent pile, outcome, effluent, well, failure, unfavorable, transmittal levels, pre-industrial above 1.5 degrees centigrade, transmittal, visible, denial, epic, monitoring, horizon error, kernel, outwork corpus, horizon fall, plume, obliterate wholeness. Where will whale? What was bird? Where forest? What ocean? Where living? Air? Have a little bit of water. Probably should have started with that. This next poem is actually using a photo from the Dust Bowl, which you'll see on the right-hand side of that page. This is titled The Basilica of Dust. No living form, the Basilica of Dust before the sun barks at the light, pours its own foundation. The basilica of dust settles, but does not open doors. There are no saints in the basilica of dust. There are no icons in the basilica of dust. There are no psalms in the basilica of dust. There are no candles in the basilica of dust. The basilica of dust proselytizes cough. The basilica of dust invites itself in, a door, a keyhole, an unsealed window, an unmasked. The basilica of dusk asks no recitation of prayer and is giving you sacrifice. Hear every breath. The basilica of dust stands over the built, over the transfigured. There are no miracles, there are no eyes, there is no tongue, there is no air. A crack, inhale. The basilica of dust is in you, corrals. No living form. The basilica of dust. The basilica of dust stands before the sun, barks at the light, pours its own foundation over the built, over the transfigured. The basilica of dust settles, but does not open doors. There are no saints in the basilica of dust. There are no miracles. There are no icons in the basilica of dusk. There are no eyes. There are no psalms in the basilica of dust. There is no tongue. There are no candles in the basilica of dust. There is no air. The basilica of dust proselytizes cough. The basilica of dusk invites itself in, a door, a keyhole, a crack, an unsealed window, an unmasked inhale. The basilica of dusk asks no recitation of prayer. The basilica of dusk is in you and is giving you sacrifice. Hear every breath, corrals. I wanted to share this poem specifically, which kind of speaks to what Don was getting at and trying to push the boundaries of where the page ends, where the work starts and begins. This is technically three different poems on 2 pages. The left is an assembly and instructional to then engage with the 2 other poems that don't actually exist in the book, that exist online, both on my website and on my publisher Omnidawn's website. I would also like to just take my hat off and thank Omnidawn for being so supportive in trying to push the bounds of what a book can be. I know it's always something I'm always thinking about, afraid of what will my publisher say when I show them this dead bird I brought to their doorstep, and will they let me in to entry? So I'm just going to read the left, and if you wanted to dive into those 2 QR codes on your own time, more than welcome. One's a poem mural that you could project on a wall. The other is actually one you could print out and assemble yourself. Nothing but a margin, but a yield. Assembly ritual. 1, walk outside. 2, whisper into the nearest tree. Will I be here tomorrow? 3, answer your own question and look directly into what remains of sun. 4, return. 3, consider the 3 feet, a 9 feet landscape, the Dust Bowl, ballads of Guthrie, the Ewan Clem, the sun. 6, 7, the landscape is broken. 9, 10, we have broken the landscape. 11, detach all 64 artifacts from the spine. 12, Sun Ra remains seeing. Space is the place. 13, locate what Sun Ra speaks of. 14, assemble 4 rows, numbers 1 through 15, then below 16 through 31, then below 32 through 47, then below 48 through 64. 15, await nature. 16, perhaps another will gather in what we did not affix. This is the first poem in a series of 15 poems in which I would go to bed every night reflecting on, these are the things poets do. Every night before bed, I would reflect on a document from the archive of the Dust Bowl and then go to sleep. And then I would wake up, and the first thing I would do before brushing my teeth, before coffee, before anything, is start a poem, and with the hope of finishing the poem by that day and then start again. This is actually in conversation with a photograph from Dorothea Lange's photo, Oklahoma mother of 5 children, now picking cotton in California near Fresno, 1936. I will say that the majority of all these photos that I engaged with did deal specifically with Fresno, hopefully, and then backing back towards away from Fresno, because I actually have family. My grandparents were Dust Bowl refugees from Oklahoma. So one side of my family is originally from Mexico, or Braceros, and the other side are Oklahoma refugees. So here I am, an Irish Mexican, reading some poems. And I'm going to start, read the title and then the epigraph. Everywhere I sleep, I see Dust Bowl 1.0. Allow us to explain ourselves. In the beginning, we were dusty, we were lovely, we were turned around. From Immigrants by Fareed Matuk. Set sun in the valley of the Placedids, of the Placedis people. Set sun, set sun, set sun. Say the word long enough, and made is the meaning. Set sun, set sun, set sun. Adapt verb to command. Set sun, set sun. Soon, even sun considers relent. Say it like you mean it, but fast. Set sun, set sun, set sun. When it happens, no one observes the Placedis people in the valley of the Placedis people. This is the opaque that never arrives, a smile on a child's face, the eyes of a family averted. In the state dream, she gathers corneas along the embankment of Highway 180. Set sun, set sun, set sun, until silhouette stands on a porch, arm extended towards me. This is harvest, she says. I am distracted by the rooster who abandons the solar for land grief. This is another from that series. This photo is actually about 2.5 hours from Fresno. It's Dorothea Lange's photo of US 99 over the ridge on ridge over Tehachapi Mountains, heavy truck route between Los Angeles and San Joaquin Valley, over which migrants travel back and forth. California, May 1939. Everywhere I sleep, I see Dust Bowl 12.0. Fence, noun, early 14th century, action of defending, resistance, means of protection, fortification, shortening of defense. Go west. We went west. Remove, deport, or exterminate the people from their land. We removed, deported, and exterminated until it was our land. Subjugate for savings. We subjugated and profited. Reduce the land. We reduced the land and sowed. Sell what is sown. We sold at market. These are the prices. We accepted the prices. Pray for rain and harvest. We dreamt and the other labored. Put down the rails and roads for speed. We put in the rails and roads and wanted faster. Put up telephone poles to communicate. We erected poles and trenched cables and now phone in. Put up fences to prevent animals and possessions from straying. We put up fences and we never strayed. This is actually a poem inspired by another poem from Francisco X. Alarcón called Jaguar. But also it's a poem inspired by a conversation, a long dreaming of making a new kind of poem with Juan Felipe Herrera, the infinite poem, which I did read in a portion of in the opening poem, a poem that has a sort of center mother line in which a line can then sprout from above or take root below and can be read away from that mother line or right to left or left to right, apologies. So this is Analog Jaguar Digitalization Forest Canopy after Francisco X. Alarcón and Juan Felipe Herrera. Jaguar, 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 cage, 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 jaguar, cage, 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 jaguar, cage, jaguar, cage, jaguar, cage, jaguar, cage, jaguar, cage, jaguar, cage, 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 jaguar. Analog Jaguar Digitalization Forest Canopy. Stay ancient, autonomous, scrub data streams. We question river. J assumes the stumbling, damned drinks galaxy. Animal, marrow, still flits, jaguar. Limb synaptic trickles, mimes crumbles. Server crossing to self sky. Algorithms echo, tree inside jaguar. What steady ring last earth has ascending applied remaining jaguar. Gone relic, heart palm, saguaro particle. Analog limb, animal, the we stay, analog server, algorithms, what has gone, jaguar, synaptic marrow, stumbling, question ancient, jaguar crossing, echo steady, ascending relic, digitalization, trickle still, damned river autonomous, digitalization to tree ring, applied heart palm, forest mimes, flits, drinks, J scrub, forest self inside, last remaining saguaro. Canopy crumbles, jaguar, galaxy assumes, data streams, canopy sky, jaguar, earth, jaguar, particle, jaguar, 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 jaguar. All right, I'm gonna get a drink of water. I once heard a famous poet write that, speak about a poem that sometimes when they read it, they get sick. Sometimes they vomit. And here I am today reading in front of that poet here in conversation. I didn't realize I had done this to myself until I began trying to read these poems out loud. Midway through this collection, in working with some of my nephews, writing poems, they were maybe 7 or 8 years old. They wrote bird, B-R-D. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting way to write bird. But more importantly, what started happening is within the universe of the rendering, what happens in the future when the air is gone, when we can't breathe, when who knows what exists anymore, if we're still here, or what is the people or the entities that are still here. I don't know if these are letters and missives from the far future to the near future, or from the far future back to now. I will try my best now to read a poem without vowels. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to stop after this poem. I have one more, but I don't know how much I'm going to have left to read another poem after this poem. The title, for chop problem. Pass. Never just mix was helps the spit we kept speak of shit and let's got more when it's smacks back the shot rip is heart riff is his fast make no all right. Thank you so much for letting me read these poems to you all today. I have the distinct honor in welcoming a fellow poet, and like I said, hero to the Zoom world today, Douglas Kearney. It's wonderful to be here with you today. I'm gonna get some water.
Get some water.
Just real quick.
Do the water. I want to, when we're in the seminars, your webinars, you can't really hear. I mean, when I'm thinking about what you're committing to, not only on the page, but what you're committing to in the air, how much your work is grappling immediately with the concepts of breath. And then breath and scarcity, right? Like what happens when you don't let yourself breathe? What happens when you don't allow yourself certain kinds of air? And I have lots of questions, but I do encourage everyone out there to put some stuff in the Quanda, use the Quanda device at the bottom. But I want to start with this one just because you ended with that one. I want to know, what are the aesthetics / politics of the cough? What?
Yeah.
Because that's a thing you're working with in not only, again, on the page, but as an utterance. So what are the aesthetics and politics of the cough?
I think, it's one of those. I'll start by prefacing that, I live in the Central Valley. We have the worst air, some of the worst air in America. I know recently there has been a whole discussion of AQI and what does AQI mean, because we're now experiencing this on like a more global scale. New York recently had some of the worst air, I think, to record. And I think about how my own life has sort of always been struggling with that idea, because growing up here, always having asthma, always having like breathing trouble. And I thought I'd outgrown it. And then as the pandemic hits, I go outside and I start coughing and I start feeling sick. And I'm like, why am I feeling this? When I realize, it's because the sky's on fire. Yeah. So that's one part. So like having that discussion of what does that mean? Who gets to breathe what? And how we can, the privilege of maybe going to the ocean and getting a breath, the privilege of going to the mountains and getting a breath, the privilege of going to the store and getting a breath, right? There's like these elements, but also more like central to this larger conversation, which became very frightening to me, was what does that cough mean in terms of like a pandemic? Because I wrote this poem maybe 2 years, maybe a year or two at least before the pandemic. And while this pandemic started spiraling, there was a point when I wanted to just like pull the book. I wanted to be like, this is too much. I don't like this. I want to push that away. I don't want this to be like in the present moment. I was thinking of more conceptually present, not like that urgent. So that's definitely something that I've had to like consider, and definitely of what, in sort of the metaphorical sense of how we can breathe and when are we at ease, and the privilege of being at ease, and thinking like, so, willingly entering into that discomfort of reading these poems, whether I'm just miming a cough, which oddly enough becomes far too easy, like it's muscle memory of how to cough, or trying to speak through a vowelless, airless poem, which becomes taxing. I think I've read one before, and I think I blacked out the next 2 hours. I have no knowledge of anything. So I'm glad we're recording this. So I'll remember.
Exactly. It happened. I mean, I grew up, as you know, I grew up in Southern California, in the 80s, late 70s and 80s. And we used to have smog alerts. Like there were days where literally they would just say, stay inside. And I used to get really terrible headaches from the smog. So that question of like the toxicity of the air, and there's a materiality, like you're looking at it and suddenly the mountains are invisible because there's this kind of yellow mist over them.
Yeah, no burn days. Days.
Well, and I mean, like, just a brief second to talk about the performance of the vowelless poem. Like, I could imagine a way of performing that where you wouldn't feel lack, right? Like you would feel, we're going to emphasize the consonants, but there's something in, and maybe this is too performance wonky, but there's something in the way that you are not allowing yourself a certain amount of air that pushes that sense of something being removed, something being extracted throughout that process.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it too. Like thinking through even like the Dust Bowl, the idea of the Dust Bowl, of like how, even having like a direct, tangible relationship to the Dust Bowl of my grandparents, so long. It's like, we made, the Dust Bowl happened. It was a dry spell, blah, 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 blah. And that's what you get like in like the history book, right? It's not like, it was man-made. We did this. We've tilled the soil. We've scraped it all out. So in some ways that's sort of reimagining that scraping out of the language too, of like what's left, and even our own language. Like, I text people PPL, I text people MTN for mountain. We all do it, right? Like it's suddenly like it's infiltrating. So like, maybe in 500 years, this might be what's left of the Western English language.
I mean, I can't speak for anybody else, but there was the kind of pleasure of reading that poem, being like, that's dear. Yes. That's fortunate. And like learning what
Mhm.
is going to be extracted,
Yeah,
specifically are the vowels, and what is still legible when those are not there, right? And I
Yes,
think that
yes.
there's just something really,
Yeah. Or the
really
difference,
wild about that.
yeah, the difference between one of the things that happened in sort of titling some of these, the FNDR is that finder, is that founder, like
Right.
how far back are we talking about now, right?
Yeah. No, that I was always coding that as founder.
Yeah, yeah.
That's my vote.
No. Yeah, totally.
So I wanted to ask, something that you and I have talked about off and on, is the kind of sense of what is available if you are a contemporary, poet of color, BIPOC poet, however you frame that. Like, there's certain types of subject matters that I won't say limited, and we're not limited to. Like, you could plumb the history, the temporal history of lynchings. You could plumb the emotional history. You could do that, and that could be a horrifying place, but a long-term place to be, right? But we also think about what are the moments when we feel like perhaps we're talking about something that is not immediately associated. Like, if you have poets' names on one side, and then you have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you have A, B, C, D, E, and there's subject matters, right? Like, how is coming to a more ecological space? And the first thing I want to say is, we know that ecological questions impact BIPOC communities intensely. So this isn't something that I think we would necessarily nominate for ourselves, this association, this concern, this interest.
Yeah.
But there is that kind of question around sort of like legibility. And even in Borderland Apocrypha, like with Borderland, you are emphasizing a political history. You're also emphasizing, there's a question that's coming up, that's talking about capitalism, what I think is very important to talk about as well. But land as being activated by its space as a resource, right? Yeah. So we have borderland. So we're already in the realm of geopolitics, but also a kind of an ecological political. So, but I am curious, how does it feel to sort of, move from the very, like sort of socio-political history among peoples, right, of Borderland Apocrypha to this more, I don't even know the adjective to use, but to the rendering.
Yeah, it's a good question, because there's a lot to unpack in it. I think for many years, I think I rejected the idea of being like an eco poet, of being like a poet who writes of the pastoral. Like that's, that was my own like oversimplified sort of perception of what like I as like a brown man navigating this world has to write about. Like, I can't write about the mountains or enjoying going to the ocean. I have to write about like the barrio, because that's what we're supposed to write about, right? That's the expectation. So like, and there's a lot to unpack in it too, because not only was I kind of like stuck in sort of that cycle of like trying to be the expected, to reach the expected like presumption of who I am and what I write. Also stylistically, I was trying to repurpose some of those styles in a style that wasn't mine. It wasn't frenetic. It wasn't broken. It wasn't shattered into a billion pieces like my brain is always thinking. So like being able to like swerve away from that, of finding sort of people out there in the world trying to do things outside of sort of that formal structure. Hence why I refer to you as a hero, because you are definitely someone who helped do that for me in like the Black Automaton, to think about how a page can explode, how words can explode, how voices can be let in. But then on top of everything else, circling all the way back, here I am living in Fresno. I spent 5 years working at a wastewater treatment plant. I am here working in this space, toiling in this space in a different way, right? Yes. Thinking about how and what I can talk about and what I can't talk about, and how long it took me to sort of just say, no, these are things that harm me, that impact me, that impact my family. How can I then sort of re-engage in that and sort of rupture that expectation? And sometimes it does happen where someone's like, you don't write like like a Fresno poet, or you don't write like a brown poet. Like, how
Where's
do
your
you?
Levis at, man? Where's your Levis?
Yeah, exactly. And then I'll think, yeah, there's, I've thought about breaking someone's hand over an exhaust pipe before. We've done that. It's a classic. No, so I think that's part of it too, of being able to give yourself that permission to like wander, finding people out there in the world who are doing that work to help explode it for you, but also being very aware that, this universe that we exist in is being impacted by like a very certain type of like capitalist, industrial, Western structure. And, what are those health outcomes? What are those impacts to our universe as BIPOC communities, right? Versus like someone who can just say, you know what? It sucks. Pandemic sucks. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to rent a house in Joshua Tree for, I'm going to ride this out. Let's see what happens, right? Versus, that, there's a certain privilege to that. So being able to like disentangle that and sort of just dive in. And that was kind of where it came to, where I found myself driving through the Midwest on my way to Chicago, and I drove through Oklahoma, and I thought how little in some areas have changed, how stuff has been abandoned and never returned. And the same way that I think about like the housing crisis in the late aughts, of how in many ways Fresno never recovered. We're still in that thing. We're still in that like struggling, stumbling forward, in that same way that we're still stumbling forward and denying climate is actively being destroyed by us, right?
Yeah, it is a self-inflicted cough.
Yes.
So this question, dovetails to this perfectly. And it's a question from the audience. Is Marx said that the bad thing about capitalism is that it dissolves all human bonds. Also, that the good thing about capitalism is that it dissolves all boundaries, borders. If borders are being dissolved by the climate crisis, isn't that a good thing? Scary, yes, but maybe a chance for radical remaking.
I think that's an interesting point that we've already sort of seen playing out in sort of like Europe, like the bad climate refugee versus the good climate refugee. Like, are you coming across the Mediterranean? Are you coming across the Balkans? Like, who and what, and how much melanin is really in your skin, right? And like, so like there's still a critical component of can we address and think through what borders mean, especially in climate, right? Because things are going to happen and people are going to have to move. That was something that obviously happened to my grandparents. They were in Oklahoma, things got bad, they moved, right? So like, how can we enter into that conversation, but also kind of abandoning the sense of like the good and the bad refugee, right? Like, we want some of these, not some of these, but also in the same sense of, because capitalism has ground all the bones, right? Because now it's just figureless, creatures out there just inhaling money for a select few, and how we're just kind of going through it and just trying to survive. So I think thinking that through, I kind of feel that it's going to enter into a conversation that we're already seeing play out in Europe in a way, more so, in some ways even here now, where you start seeing where you start talking about migrants who are coming from the Caribbean or from South America, who are of Afro or Afro-Latinx or Afro-Latinx descent, right? And like suddenly it's like, oh wait, this is, there's Haitian refugees at this border, and like, what does that mean for us as like humans who are like unhappy with our situation? Obviously this is terrible. And then what that means of trying to reinterpret what a border means. I think as we sort of do that, we have to sort of think through that openness. What are the borders that are stopping people from moving, but what are like societal borders that are stopping people from, still being enslaved, harmed, oppressed, and murdered?
Absolutely. And I mean, like, there's the question of certain kinds of policy, like fires in Southern California and California generally, right? They are oftentimes going into new developed areas, which are oftentimes more affluent suburban types of areas. A number of geographical or sort of maybe, topographical sites like beachfront or like, on the sides of cliffs, places that were also once largely owned by wealthy people, are no longer being insured because of climatic crisis. And their insurance was actually something that many of us who weren't living in those houses were also sort of subsidizing. And so in that way, we do have what might be seen as a kind of flattening, but I do think it's very important that, as you remind us, right, like all you need to create another is someone that's not you.
Yep.
So, the border might be the GPS map mode of that, but you don't need that. You don't need to know where you are according to a map maker to create another. So that part seems to me to be really interesting in this sort of question. So there's a bunch of questions about visual poems. So I'm gonna put mine away so we can get to some of these here. So John Howard says, when creating visual poems, do you normally begin with the visual artifact, or do you begin with words/thoughts? If there's variety in how you begin, are there any patterns or practices you can speak in creation of visual poems? Thanks. How you do it? Taking notes.
I think it's a combination. It's all of it, because I think sometimes, in many ways, I think in shapes first. Like I'm just like doodling on a page because I can't draw for anything. Digital illustration has been a lifesaver for me. But at the same time, so I'm sketching, I'm drawing, I'm shapes and things and directionals, but also finding forms in the research I'm doing. Like sometimes you'll see something that has an interesting shape, and like, what does that mean if that's the poem? If the shape of that is the poem? But also at the same time, while I'm doing that research, I'm thinking through the archival of what I can do with it, but not in a way that I don't feel like gross and appropriative about it, because I don't, this isn't like, I don't want to mine all this stuff or make some poems. I want it to have sort of a heft and something I'm trying to like rupture or subvert in a certain way, but also at the same time, I'm also doing that research and having these other personal memories sort of like come up and trickle up of my own experiences in the present, or historical experiences that I've heard like passed down through family. So it's a little bit of all three. And then in that case, I have all of this data, and then I kind of, like an accordion, kind of put it together and then kind of make it breathe a little bit and kind of give it a little bit of shape, a little bit of space. And sometimes some poems aren't visual. And it's a lifelong thing of trying to know, are you asserting your own conceit on it to the point that it's only about you? Or taking your foot off the gas and being like, it has to be about the work. And it's always that struggle of miming that back and forth.
Okay. So I think that some of the things you said really blend into this next question very well. And it is a question brought to us by the Sean Webster. In approaching the archival representations of the Dust Bowl while writing the rendering, did you see any limitations to the archival? Were your considerations of form informed by any archival limitations you might have come across?
Yeah, there's a few. It's one of those. The first one was, it was always so hard to understand and grapple with. So much of the archive was already like whitewashed, white gazed, right? Like so much of it, and it directed so much of it because, this is Dorothea Lange and others out on New Deal job placement as artists going out documenting things, but not getting a lot of like sort of the more larger landscape of what was happening. And you get that othering in things where suddenly I'll read a document or read a quote where it almost sounds like, John Smith in Texas talking about they're stealing our jobs. Right. And suddenly it's like, oh, wait, this is what year was this? Was this 1940? Was this 2023? I don't know.
Right, exactly.
And so like sort of that blending. So being able to sort of, the limitation of the archival sort of being sort of that lens that was being captured was definitely something that was primarily of a certain time and component. When I'm trying to sort of expound upon it in a larger context, that's where I had to sort of reinvite my own sort of invention into the process. How do we become complicit? How do I add in those other voices of family, of my own journey, of my own familial journey, and trying to like stitch the broadest picture, because in some cases it was just very limited. And that doesn't even open to the fact that we were in this situation because we forcibly removed people from that land who understood that topsoil and wind and things go away. So we have to be sort of itinerant and moving along with the land instead of taking root and this is my land and this is what we're going to do. So the question of like indigenous communities never even came up when I was doing a lot of this research. So it was very hard sort of compile that. So instead I sort of moved and shifted towards trying to interpret this through my own lens, through my own family.
I mean, do you anticipate a question that I had actually, which was how does the we function when you mark a found surface? Like there's something, you're inviting something different when we appears on a found photograph or a found document. And I'm curious about that. I mean, we have some great other questions too, so I want to get to those, but I was curious about that.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that when I did think about using we, I think far too often in some of this discussion, around climate, around sort of ecological terror, we sort of try to parse it out, them and us, or things of that nature. And in some ways, in engaging with a we on the page versus a you, like you as the reader, there's something a little bit more collective about that to invite us all in for a response, like call us all in on a responsibility to like care for our land, care for the other, and so like eliminate that and sort of this is the we and how can we do that? And I struggle with it too, only because I think for me, how it lends itself into these conversations is being of Irish Mexican ancestry, of being both, of having both of that blood in me. I'm always having to think about like, those two like push and pull elements, like here I am, my grandparents lived on land that they were probably forcibly, someone before them forcibly removed someone so they could be there. But then also here they are, coming to California, working as laborers and butchers like my other grandparents. So that we being an element in which we can better understand and be open to having a conversation of how do we fix this or what is happening, and honoring what has happened versus closing it off, closing the dialogue and starting with like a you as the perpetrator of all industrial harm. Because we all know that if, each of us recycles 1 can a day, we will save the universe.
I feel like a hero because I'm throwing away 6 plastic bottles. Oh wait, I probably shouldn't have had 6 plastic. Damn, I was almost there.
You're almost there, which goes back to it, right? Like the we has to be in the biggest sense. The we is that machine too, right?
Yeah. And then as you said, like kind of like investigating these 2 strands of your life, but then also referencing indigenous people who understood like how this worked. Like there's the we can be voracious in its attempts to bring people together, even as it can also create a group of people who are like, oh, they ain't talking to me. So I think that's something that's really dynamic about the piece and about the usage of it, and in some ways like nominates itself as a very specific, still large, but a very specific group of people. Okay. Whoa. So we got another visual poetry question, then we're going to move into a slightly different territory. So this is from, Keith Wilson. Yeah. I think one of the connections between you both as poets is both the visual aspect, but also the connection between the visual and the performance or sound of the poem. At what point in the process are you reading the poem aloud? And how is that reading of it affecting the visuals?
Yeah,
that's a fantastic question. Yeah,
I think for me, it's like tonally, that's the first question I'm thinking about when I'm like drafting the poem of like, what is this going to sound like in terms of, are these hard sounds? Are these soft? Is it more lyric? Is it more staccato and cut? But then at the very end, that's actually when I'm thinking about it out loud. And like, that's the last gate. That's the last gate or the door I walk through to be like, okay, I think I can be done with this poem, because I can see the sort of pathway through in which I can read this poem in a way that I think the poem wants to be read now. And if it doesn't, then I'll kind of strip it all back and start back again and start going through those other doors of, did I get the right form? Is this right? Was this just a cool idea that now gets to go get put in the drawer and, let it marinate for another few years or something, but that's kind of where I am at. Like at the very end, I'm thinking through like, I've written this thing. Now, how do I utter it? And in some of these cases, the poems that I read today, like those vowelless poems, I did not think about reading them out loud until I read them out loud, like and it's like, here we are.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just to co-sign that, there are times where I realize that I've screwed myself over because of what I made and never thinking about uttering it.
Yeah.
And there is something about that moment when you are figuring it out on the spot.
Yeah.
There's something that's extraordinarily powerful about that. I mean, this question in some ways kind of is deepening what you were just saying in terms of like asking for a slightly even nerdier detail. And this is from Elena Karina Byrne. You're a co-editor, co-Omnidawn author, I should say. Considering the physiology of the phrases as they encounter the physical images on the page, can you describe your process in creating this dialogue? So you were talking a little bit about how you kind of know when something's sort of finished, or if it seems to be having this chime, rooted in shape. When you are conscious of that physiological aspect, the very concrete, the meatness of that language, and this sort of physical image on the page, which oftentimes, points at a sort of a three-dimensional sort of a space, even when it's not one. What's the process that kind of mobilizes those two things in tension with each other or in collaboration or both?
Yeah, I think some of it, the collaboration is also still engaged with the archive, I think, because there's a certain, especially in some of these cases where it's definitely something that's involving the archive. I think because I'm thinking through both the form, the sort of sonic quality of the poem, but also like, what were the documents sort of saying? What was sort of echoing from that? And how can I sort of imbue that in a way into the work? So it's a really, someone asked me a question about something similar to this, like, walk me through making a poem. And I realized, so I walked through making the poem, what a poem would look like. And it was like an hour and a half later, and they looked at me like, oh my God, what are you doing to yourself? Right? Because it's like all of the, it's like I've taken these like 5 steps and made them 900 steps to like go through and find that form, find that language, strip it back out, strip it back, or open it back up, put it back in, and sort of finding the rhythm that needs to happen. That in some ways, I'll say a lot of this is just in the mania of the research and like going with it, just like researching. And then suddenly you have to stop and you have to write. And there's a point where it's, 80% subconscious, 20% conscious thought, right? And so it's there and it's coming through. And that 20% is sort of, you're on the back of a shopping cart going down a hill, trying to like steer it the right way and just hoping and praying that you're landing somewhere that you don't want to land in against, in the ravine, so to speak. So that's kind of it, like thinking through those elements of what those details are in that archive, specifically with an archival artifact, right? And sometimes that was helpful. In this case, sometimes I'd go back and look at the back of what Dorothea Lange, or one of the artists who had captured things, is in the back of the photograph, like it's just a very generic, which I share in some of the epigraphs, in the same way that I spent like months and months listening to Woody Guthrie's Dust Bowl ballads, and suddenly out of nowhere, I'll just start singing, I got that dust, pneumonia, my lungs. And people are like, what is wrong with you? And I'm like, well, I'm in a bad place, guys.
Yeah. It's a nightmare. It's in the nightmare.
That's it. So like kind of like working through that. So just that, I think the easiest way to answer that question is like trying to like invite in the archive, but also knowing that I have to get to a place to make the poem, because I started out by trying to make a poem, right? And in some cases, what does that invention do? Because on top of everything else, how can I invite things beyond the book, beyond the page for others to engage in, right? Like those QR codes. How can you go out and make a poem? How can you go out and project a poem on a wall and engage with this giant landscape of a poem, which is basically a concrete poem of a landscape? So thinking that through too. So like pushing that and never even sure if it lands in the right place. Like I still, you still always have those doubts, right? Did I go too far? Did I overexert my mania onto this poem?
Oh, wow. So we have time for one last question. I'm going to ask that. I want to tell everybody that these questions are fantastic, and I'm going to share them with Anthony. Several of them, I think he's referenced a little bit in here, but let's move from I've got that dust to what you don't got. So let's say from Megan Bromley, it seems like many of these poems have a notable without vowels, without air, without an assigned linear reading. What is it like to write into absence or write without something? And how might this be different than writing about something? And just as a quick note, you're going to be answering this without much time. So let's see if we can
Totally
nail it in a minute.
I think that bridges Sean's question and questions about the limitations of the archive, right? There's always going to, like, when you're working with histories, you're working with people that were in some cases long alive and dead before you were alive and dead. So so it's like you're trying to go back and reach to these things that never have a concrete thread that you can like track all the way back. So there's always going to be that gap and that absence in trying to find the answer, because like any poem, I think, it's like foundationally what we all as poets tell other people, you can't assert your answer to the poem. The poem's going to do what it wants to do, right? You can't just say, this is my poem and this is going to be the answer. In the same way, that's the archive. Because we'll go digging, we'll go finding, I'll start writing, and I'll want an answer. And I can't have one because the archive won't give it to me. But I know that there's something tangibly there. There's a tone there. There's an emotion there. Heck, I even tried to summon a photo that never existed in this book with my grandparents, because I knew that photo, I felt the memory of that photo, but I don't know if the photo ever happened and I don't have it. So here we are trying to write towards that absence. So yes, in many ways, there is a definite reaching towards a past, reaching towards a future of that absence too. And the discomfort of, if we are existing and continue on this trajectory of annihilation, who's being annihilated, right? What's going to survive, and how that absence can sort of be a place that we can look towards in some sort of strange oracle of like humanoid futuristic being that's trying to send us something back, which sounds frightening.
Yeah, I think ending on fear is
the way to go.
Generally where we should be right now. I want to thank Jenna, Lincoln, Sylvia, and Anonymous for your questions. I apologize we weren't able to get to them. Victoria was asking something about the title and how rendering has many meanings. And I'd like to just integrate that into my final little closing remarks as we thank Anthony for being here and for his work. A rendering is a performance. A rendering is an architectural schematic. A rendering is something that you can apply to a wall. A rendering is a surrender of what's owed. But a rendering is also a melting down. And I think that all of these senses of the word rendering team within this collection like dust motes, and they get into us and make us push ourselves out. The blurb I wrote for this book is a heat stroke dreamake. The rendering renders a digital dust bowl of land and data over the poet's anger, over pages of apocalyptic eco-deteriorization, over maps to the extinct and dying. Anthony Cody does to the poem what Desert Sun does to signage, cracks it open, peels it back, tears letters away to expose the blistered surface underneath. Drama, documentary, epic, and ekphrasis gather here to be shattered by Cody's dynamic visual praxis and turbulent dread, smoking wreckage at a dead end of U.S. ancient future. Certainly, I trust the poet who writes, quote, "The annihilation of anything is exhausting," end quote. Even so, this Bravura collection asserts that in recording destruction, Cody can make a stunning warning against it. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you to the Roosevelt series and Harvard Radcliffe Institute. I've been Douglas Kearney. This was Anthony Cody.